Welcome to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy you could join us today, and happy to welcome back to the program Eli Gullatt, who is a Young Voices contributor and probably carries a few more hats than that. Tell us just a little bit about yourself, Eli, for the sake of people meeting you for the first time.
Yes, thank you for having me back on, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I am a recent graduate from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I studied urban planning and public policy, and I'm currently the branch leader for American Conservation Coalition's Raleigh-Durham branch.
Well, I'm looking at an article that you penned for sustainabilitytimes.com, and I'll admit, I see headlines about California wildfires a lot. It seems like every year. It's like earth-shaking, wildfires taking place in California. But your headline is "Better Housing Can Help Fight California's Devastating Wildfires." So let's dive into that. First of all, let's talk a little bit about why does California have so many extremely devastating wildfires in the first place?
So the reason for our current situation in California in regards to wildfires is a range of factors. Some of them have to do with climate change. I addressed some of this in my article. Climate change simply makes the probability of these type of really harmful natural disasters more likely. It just increases the probability, but in terms of other factors that have led to this current wildfire crisis that California has been facing, include the history of forest mismanagement by California's Forest Services, and histories of being against sort of controlled burns of their wildfires. Another contributor, and this is one that I think addresses more about my article, is California's land use, which puts a lot of people more at risk for these wildfires, so that when they do happen, it has this more direct impact on the individual.
Yeah, I've heard the term urban sprawl before, and I guess I just kind of filled in my own associations for what that must mean. But you describe in your article what urban sprawl is and how this is a very real part of California. I mean, there are just so many people. This is what it's like. For those who aren't familiar with the term, what do you mean when you say urban sprawl?
Yes. Urban sprawl refers to the way that American metropolitan areas have slowly and gradually expanded further into the outer reaches. So instead of having these tightly and connected, dense urban centers, we often have suburban and exurban communities. You might have heard the term exurban, which is sort of that outer ring from the suburbs. And because of a range of policy decisions at both the federal and state levels, we have really incentivized this kind of development through things like single-family home exclusive zoning and car dependency through really large investments into highway expansion and other sort of incentives and subsidies for people who can live further out.
Okay, so more people getting further out, into the land actually, puts them at more risk, obviously, from the urban centers. But something you pointed out in your article is, okay, the cars that they drive, particularly those that are, spewing carbon, even if people were to all switch to electric cars overnight, would it really have that much impact?
Yeah, so definitely in the short term, that's not going to have the kinds of impacts that we're going to need to actually solve our current climate change problems and California's wildfire problems. The big problem is we're currently still running our battery powering systems through fossil fuels. So the electric car is definitely a step in the right direction, but it isn't necessarily going to solve the problem. Additionally, even if we were to transition everyone over to an electric car in California, for example, it would not change the sort of carbon emissions that come from simply living so much further away from, say, your job, where your kids go to school, all these sort of day-to-day activities we do every day. This is going to be because of the sort of carbon emissions that come from basically when cars hit asphalt when they're driving, which is a small thing, but also produces air pollution. It's not as bad as it is with fuel powered cars, but it's still a concern. And then also that kind of development that we're going to need if we're going to continue on this infrastructure path. We're still going to have to spend more money on expanding highways and expanding roads further into the outer reaches. So, okay,
and talk to me a little bit about what are some of the downfalls or the drawbacks rather of trying to house people in those urban centers. Is part of the reason that there's so much of that sprawl because there are so many restrictions zoning wise that it's very hard to create housing?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of the biggest drivers in California is that it's just really hard to build new housing that people want to live in these urban centers where people do want to live. The reason those rents are so high is because people want to live there, but they can't, and they get priced out and pushed further into the outer edges of the city. And this is often driven not only by the zoning laws that I talk more directly. So there's like limits on how tall a building can be, how much it can be near the road, the minimum lot size requirements, and then also parking requirements are often involved for new apartment buildings, which only increases the cost for developers and further uses up more space and, continues to sprawl out the urban landscape. The other things that in California in particular faces is long permitting requirements. So this makes the cost of development much higher because you spend so much longer as a developer sort of in this waiting phase, waiting for each, level of the government to get back to you on whether or not you can proceed with actually breaking ground on a new project. And then on top of that, California has something called Sql Laws, which are the California Environmental Quality Acts. And it's actually born out of the federal NEPA laws, which is our National Environmental Policy Act. So it sort of creates a mini NEPA situation and allows for community input and the submission of environmental impact statements for new projects that may theoretically harm the environment, which sort of it's sort of ironically that in some ways these types of requirements actually make the environmental impacts much worse because they continue to push environmental housing projects further out into the outer reaches, like I mentioned, increasing the likelihood for wildfires risks and also producing more carbon emissions.
I hope this question doesn't take us too far off track, but I'm just wondering, how do city planners, how do zoning officials, how do you balance the upside as well as the downside of having more people in less space, like, higher density housing in those urban centers? Because it seems like there's going to be a trade-off one way or the other. There's convenience on the one hand, less people having to drive to get where they're trying to go. On the other hand, that's a lot of people in one place. It seems like that would come with some problems or challenges too.
Yeah, I think in practice, our current system makes it really difficult to actually do a cost-benefit analysis for new projects. Because what actually ends up happening is a lot of cronyism in the process. So when you have these types of laws, now the process is not just about building new housing or developing something new. It's about, a developer trying to pay off a city council member so they can get what they want into the process, which is a thing we know does happen, part because these laws are sometimes so vague or so cumbersome that it's easier to just pay off someone. So I think the first step we need to do is to just be very clear about what we care about and how we're going to create clear and obvious rules for people to follow that are much simpler than we currently have. Focus more specifically on health and safety, like building code laws, rather than on these sort of nebulous ideas about community design or, neighborhood character. We don't want to build an apartment here because this neighborhood character is built for single families at the home. So
what about single family zoning? I know that you mentioned in your article, that's pretty much been the norm for a long time. What has Governor Newsom done in terms of that? And by eliminating single family housing zoning, does that change the landscape?
So as of 2021, Gavin Newsom, in conjunction with the legislature, has banned single-family zoning. But this does not change the immediate landscape of California for a few reasons. The first is that they're going to end up and already are in litigation with a lot of these cities who want to maintain their zoning powers and are nervous about having those powers taken by the Newsom administration or the broader California state government. And then the other one is that, just because you lift those zoning laws does not necessarily change all these other rules that we have in place that continue to push people further out. It still doesn't answer the permitting requirements, the Sql laws that I mentioned before, parking mandates. All these things are still in place. So, there's some variation between localities. But if you actually want to solve this, it's not just a single family zoning. It's an overhaul of the way we think about land use in California and across the United States.
We've got just under a minute left, but I'd like to ask you, who's most likely to resist? Who's most likely to support those needed changes?
So I definitely think the people most likely to support these laws are the people who want to live in these places, people who have been pushed out in many ways because they've been priced out of, really high opportunity cities like San Francisco. And then I think the people most likely to oppose are going to be long-term homeowners who view this as almost an infringement on their property values and want to sort of use the state to keep those property values arbitrarily high.
Okay, great answer. And in record time, we're talking with Eli Gullatt. He is a Young Voices contributing fellow as well as the head of the American Conservation Coalition's Raleigh-Durham branch. Where can people follow you on social media?
You can find me at Market Urbanists on Twitter, or you can find ACC's Twitter profile at ACC_triangle.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Kir Nuthi back to the program. She is a regular contributor for Young Voices. And Kir, for the people who are meeting you for the very first time, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Hi, yeah. So I'm Kir Nuthi. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit think tank based in DC, Brussels, and London.
And I'm happy to hear that you are now permanently living in the UK. That's got to feel good to be settled there.
It's feeling quite nice. It is a bit more tumultuous than I was expecting, just given the cost of living crisis and the fact that I don't think I really felt it where I lived in the US. Wow.
Well, that's a topic hopefully we'll get a chance to explore at another time. I don't follow UK news as closely, of course, as someone who actually lives there, but tell me about their online safety bill. This is really intriguing to me because I have a hunch that there may be some people on this side of the Atlantic who would like to do something similar. What's the basis for this online safety bill?
Yeah, it is. Well, it feels kind of like the American Section 230 content moderation fights. It is the UK's attempt to be a world leader in online safety and content moderation. So it's focusing on what can we create to enforce legal obligations on online services, i.e. social media, search engines, etc., to minimize the content that the government doesn't want online, which I say minimize the content that the government doesn't want online because that in and of itself can be quite problematic. Oh,
I just saw a video on Twitter, I think it was just last week, of one of your fellow Young Voices contributors, Connor Tomlinson, having a bit of a discussion with a woman somewhere in public, and there was a police officer standing by. Connor used the word insidious, and I believe he was using it to describe the woman's position on something, and he wasn't angry when he said it, but this police officer stepped up and threatened to arrest him for using that kind of language. And it made me stop and think, you really can get in deep trouble if you say something insulting or something that's considered offensive or demeaning, depending on who's reading it. I understand you have a risk of finding yourself, running afoul of the authorities.
Yeah. And when it comes to free expression, that can be quite problematic because communities all across the world are just so diverse. And when we as a society agree something's not correct, that can work on a small scale. But then if the government decides what conversations we're allowed to talk about online, then our civil liberties, our civil rights, conversations about both of those come into question on, is that going to be okay after online regulation? And for social media, that is kind of devastating because it is a user-created, user-focused internet. So the user should be the focus of online regulation more so than prescriptions.
When they talk about legal but harmful language, who gets to decide? Who makes that call? Because it sounds like that could easily be a subjective call.
Legal but harmful has been a very large topic with regards to the online safety bill. It's kind of content that's not necessarily illegal, but presents a material risk of significant harm to an appreciable number of children or adults in the UK. A lot of those words I've just said are incredibly subjective, which when in practice with the bill makes it even worse. The online safety bill gives a lot of discretion to the regulator, Ofcom, and the Secretary of State for digital culture, media, and sport, which is kind of like a senator or congressional representative in charge of defining this committee. They get to change the rules when they want, and it's going to be really hard to consistently apply that subjective definition when the Secretary of State and Ofcom can choose to add or subtract or clarify things on the list. And that could just make speech more political than it already is. And politicizing online speech regulation sounds like a red flag.
Oh, that sounds like a minefield in a cow pasture somewhere where you got to watch your step everywhere you go. What are some of the topics, or what are some of the categories where people would have to really watch what they're talking about? In other words, where are people more likely to take offense under such a bill?
I've been focusing a lot on how nuance is everything. So it's content that feels like it would be okay, but that might just get over moderated. So when we're talking about postpartum depression and like awareness around that, could that then get over moderated because it's considered self-harm? Is the terror of war photo of that child that got taken down by Facebook in 2016, are we going to have more incidences of journalism photos getting taken down because the content that the online safety bill is targeting sounds like those categories? It's going to be content that made today's current social movements succeed. Like I mentioned in a report I wrote about the bill, Arab Spring, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, but there are more pressing topics today that are using social media to succeed, like Iran and Ukraine. Like these are moments of journalistic and democratic importance that the bill does not make a flexible and agile response to. And because of that, we're losing the nuance that makes person-to-person speech so hard to regulate in a bill that tries to do too much by focusing on illegal content, legal but harmful content, content harmful to children, and content harmful to adults. It's doing too much to actually take into account the nuance of human conversation.
In addition to some of the risks that such a bill would pose to free speech, talk to me about privacy. Will it have impact on online users' privacy as well?
Yes. This is the part I find really different from a lot of international content moderation proposals. It covers more than just social media and search engines. It's extending the reach into over-the-top messaging platforms, which are the WhatsApps and the iMessages and the Signals and Wires of the world. It's those apps we download onto our phones because we want to protect our privacy more or less, or use a different service to get what we want. Signal and Wire and WhatsApp use end-to-end encryption to make sure that if I'm talking to you, you and I are the only people who can read our messages, not even the service. Maybe somebody behind us if they're staring directly at our phone, right, which would be really creepy in its own right. That just makes the platform feel safer for users by protecting their privacy in a way that an unencrypted service doesn't necessarily. Now, these platforms are used by everybody. I use it to talk to my husband, but human rights activists, LGBT youth, abuse survivors, dissidents, especially relevant today, dissidents, are using it to stay safe from persecution and violence. So if the online safety bill covers these platforms, then all of those content moderation restrictions and conversations we were just talking about applies to content that services can't see. So then all of a sudden, these services are going to be incentivized to get rid of these privacy protections we've come to respect and want and use for sometimes normal situations, but sometimes much more extreme life or death ones.
Kir, we're down to about 1 minute left in this segment, but what are some of the solutions that you put forth in your article?
I would love to see encrypted communications gone from the online safety bill. If we can nix encrypted communications and something of the age assurance measures put in the online safety bill, I think it will do a lot to preserve the civil liberties of users. There's a couple options on how they could tackle illegal but harmful content. They could just nix the entire section altogether, focus on illegal content, or, and this might sound slightly controversial, create a Section 230 style reform and Section 230 style law to preserve moderation and online safety in some form of a trade-off. All of that's to say the bill needs multiple significant amendments and gutting to make sure that UK users and international users aren't going to find an internet that they don't recognize in a few years.
All right. I love the article. We'll have a link to it in the show notes. Again, we are talking with Kir Nuthi. Kir, where can people contact you or rather find you on social media?
You can find me on social media at Kir Nuthi on Twitter, or you can find my work and all of my amazing colleagues' work at datainnovation.org.
Thank you so much. Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Very happy to welcome Joshua Crawford back to the program. He, of course, is a Young Voices contributor. And Joshua, since the last time we talked, your title has changed. I see that you are now the director of the Criminal Justice Initiative at the Georgia Center for Opportunity.
That is correct.
Well, congratulations. And anything else that you'd want our listeners to know about you, those meeting you for the first time?
So I focus most of my work on urban violence and criminal justice more broadly construed. That's the work that I'll do for GCO. It's the work that I did before for those who are regular listeners. But a large chunk of my work focuses on reducing urban violence in America's large and medium-sized cities. And,
you know, I don't want to sound like, I'm being gloomy here, but I sure get the impression as I see the news headlines that crime is on the rise and apparently is becoming a much bigger issue for a lot of people across the country. Does that align with reality?
Yeah, absolutely. Crime and violent crime in particular is a top 4 issue for most voters and most polls heading into the midterms. And it reflects a reality that we have basically been on a 6-year up or even trajectory in terms of violence. And in the last several years, especially, that violence has not just encompassed things like homicides and non-fatal shootings and carjackings and things like that, but has perpetuated down to these sort of smash and grab robberies that you see in some large coastal cities and sort of just general disorder that people are pretty fed up with.
So this is having an impact on economic opportunities and for people in those communities with very high crime rates. Talk to me about the negative impact it has on their opportunities for business or even for that matter where they can shop for groceries.
Right. Yeah. People tend to think of the poverty crime relationship as directional from poverty to crime. Right. Poverty spurs crime, those kinds of things. And as it relates to violent crime, there's really not any research that suggests that that's the case. The relationship is actually much more cyclical and to a greater degree is even directional in the other direction. When you look at individuals of similar demographics, similar racial and ethnic demographics that are in the bottom quartile of income earners, one of those individuals that lives in a pretty desolate community, but with low rates of violence versus one who lives in a similar community, but with high rates of violence, the economic mobility of the person in the high rate of violence community is much, much lower. In other words, our poorest residents in poor communities that don't have high rates of violence are much more likely to be able to live out the American dream than those who live in areas with high rates of violence.
Yeah. And I was looking at your article, I remember seeing these news headlines. Starbucks closing 16 locations in Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. Walgreens, actually, they're probably not the only ones in the Bay Area of California. But, as crime becomes a bigger problem, I can totally understand why these businesses would hesitate to stay open. It puts their employees at risk. They're losing, due to theft and so forth. What are some of the more likely solutions? We don't want vigilante squads roaming the streets, but what can we do to make a community safe in which to do business?
Yeah, absolutely. The public safety question here is a relatively straightforward one. Crime, especially violent and serious crime, concentrates among a very small number of individuals within a very small number of micro locations. But those individuals in those locations tend to also concentrate in sort of macro level communities. And so that's why you hear people talk about sort of high crime communities. It's not that a large percentage of the population is committing crimes. It's that the small number of recidivist offenders concentrate in particular areas. And so what you have to do is concentrate resources on those individuals. That's law enforcement and corrections resources, but it's also social service resources, right? You can get a lot of bang for your buck if you focus on the right people, as opposed to sort of perceived dragnet policies, lock everybody up, or, occupation style policing. Those kinds of things will have some public safety benefit, but will cause a lot of harms too. If instead you appropriately target the people that are driving this violence, typically within the subcontext of street gangs or street groups, then you can get all of that public safety benefit and more without a lot of those other consequences.
I also wonder about the perception. Because, look, I know there's a lot of stuff that's reported in the news that we get that availability bias where, wow, that must really be happening everywhere. In reality, the crime may be going up, but it's not like everybody has lost their moral compass and it's every man for himself, is it?
No. One of the misnomers about crime is that basically that criminals are born, right? That there's a certain group of people that are going to go out and commit crimes, and there's really nothing you can do about it, or that everybody is a criminal at heart, or those kinds of things. And the truth is that virtually everybody has the ability to be a criminal, has the possibility to be a criminal. But human beings are rational and respond to internal and external stimuli, right? So for some people, it's their internal moral compass that would keep them from ever committing an act of violence. And for other people, it's various external stimuli. It's reducing the opportunities for crime. It's making apprehension for crime more likely. And so because people are rational and respond to those external stimuli, you can reduce crime by doing the right things, but you can also increase crime by doing a lot of the wrong things. And we're living through a time period coming out of COVID-19 and through a variety of changes in policy at the city level where folks have done some really silly things that we're now seeing the downside of.
So in your opinion, what's the wisest thing or the wisest approach that policymakers could do in the near term to start to mitigate some of these challenges for those particular high crime areas?
Yeah, so the first thing is to recognize the truism that I stated earlier, that this is a relatively small number of people, and to focus on those people. And you can do that through law enforcement, through what's referred to as focused deterrent strategies. You can do that in sentencing practices through enhancements for particular behaviors, particular ways in which crimes are committed. That way you go after your problem actors without expanding that net for a bunch of other people. And then you can do sort of strategic changes to the physical environment. There are tremendous crime-reducing benefits to things like shoring up or tearing down abandoned buildings, improving street lighting, cleaning and greening vacant lots. And obviously that's a very tall task if you try to do it for a whole city. But if you overlay maps of those physical disorders with maps of crime and focus on the high crime areas first, you can get a lot of benefit very quickly.
Now, could that be likened to the broken windows theory that I think New York City used so successfully about 30-some years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. The truism that James Q. Wilson and George Kelling, when they first wrote Broken Windows for the Atlantic, identify is that people respond to the environment around them, and a physically disordered environment is going to incentivize and encourage other misdeeds. And this is borne out considerably in the research, and that just by altering that physical environment, without making a single arrest, without a single prosecution, just by altering that physical environment, you can drive down crime, and serious and violent crime included.
So where do you see this? I'm not trying to call names of any cities, but where are the biggest problems right now? Where, if you had to pick a locality in America that would be a great place to start to model this to others, where would you choose?
Yeah, so there's sort of two categories of cities that are experiencing problems right now. What I refer to as the historically safe cities that are sort of in unprecedented times over the last 6-7 years. Those are cities like Louisville, Kentucky, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Minnesota, places like that. they are basically trying to get back to a place that they were just a decade ago. And then you have the historically high crime cities that are experiencing this as well. Places like St. Louis, Missouri, Baltimore, Maryland, New Orleans, Louisiana, that not only need to reverse their recent trends, but have a lot more work to do than that. There are some cities that have handled this really well. Gary, Indiana is a city that has historically struggled with violence, but has been able to contain it over the last couple of years. Miami, Florida has done an excellent job of not seeing increases in violence in recent years. So there are some bright spots, and there are some places that cities can learn from.
All right, Joshua, we're down to 1 minute left. I have to ask you this. As far as the people who are likely to support this, who's in favor? Who would resist this kind of reform?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to ideology at the end of the day, right? If your ideology says that human beings are at their best in a state of nature when they are unencumbered by society and structures, and that the only way to make people good is to tear down those structures, then you're not going to be particularly persuaded by this. But anyone who I would say from sort of the moderate left to the moderate right, who sees these institutions as important, who value public safety, and who understand that we can move the needle on this, that is who should be supportive of this.
Okay, we're talking with Joshua Crawford. He's the director of the Criminal Justice Initiative at the Georgia Center for Opportunity, as well as a Young Voices contributor. Joshua, where can our listeners find you on social media?
So all of my stuff moving forward will be on the Georgia Center for Opportunity's website and their social media. But if you're interested in engaging with me directly, Instagram is the best platform to do that. It's jcrawford502.
All right. Thank you so much. Great to visit with you.
Thank you.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment today on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Roy Mathews back to the program. Roy, good to catch up with you. For people meeting you for the first time, tell us just a little bit about who you are.
Yeah, so like you said, my name's Roy. I am currently the press secretary for Bruce Poliquin for Congress. He is the Republican candidate running in Maine's 2nd Congressional District, which is the largest district east of the Mississippi River. And before that, I used to work at an energy think tank in Washington, D.C.
All right. Now, you were telling me before we jumped on the air that you are in Maine and you're enjoying fall. And I got to admit, I'm a little bit jealous. I've never been to New England or, to the East Coast for fall, but I hear it's the best that there is. Having said that, that also means that the cold weather is coming. And I'm looking at an article that you wrote for, I believe it's the Boston Herald. And that is Maine's heating oil crisis is about to get worse. I did not realize that, I know cost of everything's going up, but tell me about the heating oil crisis that Maine is facing.
Right. So Maine and Hawaii are two of the most oil-dependent states in the nation. Maine has the largest proportion of homes that are heated with heating oil in the entire country. Over 60% of Maine homes are heated with heating oil. That's compared to a national average of around 4%. And of course, with the ongoing energy crisis, refineries have decided to produce more gasoline and more diesel to, to make up the supply gap. That's why prices are so high. Also caused by federal interference in the oil and gas process. But in choosing to produce more diesel and gasoline, they are choosing to not produce other distillates like heating oil that Maine families really do depend on.
Wow. I've been sitting here feeling sorry for Europe, and part of this is because I have a daughter who lives in Germany. But I know the cost of keeping your home warm this winter is really going to be daunting for people in Europe. I didn't think that, other than the rising cost of energy here, I didn't think we would see anything that could approximate a crisis. But what you're describing sounds like it could get pretty ugly.
Yeah, and Maine has a unique demographic. We're one of the oldest states in the nation, I believe the 3rd or 2nd oldest state in the nation. So we have a lot of retirees and a lot of folks on Social Security and fixed incomes. And when you're retired and you're living in these rural communities like Madison, Maine, which is up up near Skowhegan, where, there's more moose than people, right? So when you're living in these communities and you're 60, 70, 80, you need these heating trucks to actually fill up your tank for the winter in order to keep yourself warm. And heating oil is topped, I believe, $5.86 per gallon. That was in May of 2022. It's come down to around $4.40 to 50 cents a gallon. But a lot of these folks that are living on, $3,000 Social Security checks or retirement plans from the federal government, that's a massive amount of money that they're going to take out of their own pockets to heat their home. And if you're a senior, you've got to drive yourself to the doctor. You've got to pick up groceries. You got to go see your grandkids. So a lot of these folks are really, really having a hard time right now.
So let's talk about what are some of the proffered solutions, assuming that there are, people in leadership positions that are looking at this. Is anybody stepping up and saying, okay, here's what we have to do?
So the Maine delegation filed for LHEAP, which is a federal government program to get heating oil assistance. However, they decided to do this in late July when the price of heating oil was already at near $6 a gallon for at least the preceding 4 or 5 months. And with this inflation that we've talked about, they applied for about maybe heating oil assistance for about 40,000 Maine homes. Well, if the heating oil is, let's say, $4.50 a gallon, that's not going to heat 40,000 homes. That's going to heat maybe 25,000 or 30,000. And the amount of funds that they actually appropriated for this heating oil assistance is only enough to fill up Maine heating, the average Maine heating oil tank about halfway for all of Maine homes. So it's really too little too late. It's a drop in the bucket at this point. And, it's just another example of people seeing that the oil and gas industry is bad. Therefore, we must regulate it out of existence. But there are states like Maine, and I mentioned Hawaii before, that literally truck in all their fuel needs by truck or by rail that's also run on these fuels. So when you throttle the industry, this is what folks have to deal with. And like I said, we have a lot of seniors, and it's really getting scary. I was up in Madison, Maine, the same town I mentioned before, and I was at a gas station. We talked to this woman who was filling up her kerosene for her mobile home, since a lot of the mobile homes up here are heated with kerosene. Kerosene is almost $6 a gallon, so that's even worse. So it's the poorest Mainers that are going to be hit hardest by this crisis. I'm glad you mentioned kerosene, because I have a few friends who like to live as close to off the grid as they possibly can, and the complaint that they've had, and this is out west, but they've said kerosene is almost impossible to find right now. I don't know the reasons behind it, but $6 a gallon, that must mean supply is getting scarce, or demand is getting higher. No, the demand for kerosene is off the charts here. You mentioned people that live off the grid. There are these places in Maine called plantations, and we also have unorganized territories. I believe we're one of only 7 states that still have those. These areas, there is effectively no local government. So it is I joke, but it's a libertarian's paradise. You build your log cabin and you have nobody else around, right? But these people that have, lived this way for generations, that have cut their own wood, that have heated their own homes, they still depend on kerosene and all these different distillates to heat their homes. And we've got Mainers that are gathering firewood like we're living in the 1800s, because they just can't afford to pay for kerosene or heating oil or any of these other distillates to heat their homes. So, I understand these folks that want to live off the grid. Believe me, I'm kind of jealous. But we shouldn't they shouldn't get the short end of the stick just because we're overly concerned about climate change. And that is a problem. But we need to have an energy portfolio that welcomes all sorts of energy. I love solar just as much as I love gasoline. Just let me choose. If we let Mainers choose, then everybody's happy. As long as we have massive supplies of each type of energy, it'll all be cheap and we'll be fine.
So let's talk about energy policies. What needs to change to allow us to meet those needs, without, inadvertently putting ourselves back into the 19th century?
Well, to start, if we could turn back the clock and prevent the Biden administration from leaving hundreds of oil and gas leases in limbo, that created this sort of lack of supply. And we're just now playing catch up with it. I believe just this past week, OPEC which is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, decided to give the United States the equivalent of the finger and say that they're not going to increase production. We have more than enough energy at home. It's just the federal government and the state governments that impose these regulations that make it prohibitively expensive to drill for any of this energy. We need more pipelines. We need to start producing more energy at home. We produce energy much more cleaner than China and Saudi Arabia because we have such stringent environmental standards. Those environmental standards are a good thing, and companies have worked their tails off to meet those standards. But the current administration just doesn't want to see oil and gas be a part of the energy portfolio. And the Maine state government has put a lot of money into solar panel farms up here, which is a good idea, except Maine is freezing cold and cloudy, and we have winter storms for a large part of the year. And just one last thing, there's been proposals for offshore wind turbines. And if you think about Maine, you think a lobster. And those proposals has very much upset a lot of the lobstermen who are going to see their livelihoods impacted too.
Wow. So what would it take? And I'm asking you to kind of, read the tea leaves for me, if you would, Roy. I'm just wondering what it would take to shift both the federal administrations as well as some of the state administrations to where they might back down a little bit on some of these green policies that are shortchanging us on energy.
I think it's just going to take, and it's going to be hard for me to say this, it's going to, take going through it. Europe's going through it right now with Germany, I believe, rationing energy. And folks are scared up here. And honestly, you get what you vote for. I'm not at all attacking people who decided to vote for the current administration or anything like that. But this is an example of what happens when we allow people that are just hostile to American energy to gain power. And I think really the only solution here is to, we got to have a change in Congress, a change in the administration, and we've got to pump the brakes on all these green policies. We can have solar farms, we can have wind turbines. That's great, but we need to have a balance. And let me just say, these are just my opinions. These do not reflect my candidate or the campaign that I'm working for. This is all coming from me.
Okay, we are talking with Roy Mathews. He is a Young Voices contributor, and congratulations on your work working on the campaign. We'll have a link to your article in the show notes, but tell people where they can find you on social media.
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at yaboyroy98. There's an underscore in between yaboy and Roy. There's a lot of campaign stuff right now, so apologies in advance. And you can find me on just the Young Voices website, youngvoices.org/talent, and just search for my name in that great roster of writers.